All right, so today I'm going to talk about CLE 2023, some of the overviews, the experiences, and some of the strategies for next year. So as some of you might remember, I went to Greece a couple weeks ago, and I went to go see this conference. And this is my first academic conference. So I want to split this up into two separate portions. One will be a lot meatier than the other. First is the actual experience. So I'll talk a little bit about the organization of the conference, the schedule, and I'll talk about some of the takeaways from the keynotes, the labs, and the conference sessions. I'll give an overview of a couple of the presentations that I thought were interesting as I was there, and then I'll give some thoughts around the entire experience. I also want to talk just very briefly about strategy for next year. I'm not going to go into depth about how to approach things, but I just want to outline kind of the very high level things that need to be done in order for us to get to a point where we can start working on solutions for next year's labs. Just in case you didn't know, CLE is French for key, and so that's why the logo for the CLE conferences are all in the shape of keys. Yeah, this year CLE took place in Thessaloniki, Greece. Thessaloniki is northeast of Greece, so it's pretty far from where Athens is. It was a really interesting stay. I got maybe one and a half days to kind of walk around and just experience Thessaloniki as a tourist. But it was pretty cool. The weather was nice, and when I was there, they had a expo going. They had a 2-week expo where they had like 14 buildings full of merchants and presenters and all these things. And it was really nice. But I wasn't there just to be a tourist. I was there to attend the 14th International Conference of the CLE Association. So CLE is the conference and labs of the Evaluation Forum. It's a information retrieval conference that is focused on evaluating data sets and to solve real practical problems through the practical implementation of information retrieval systems. It's related to some of these other initiatives. SIG-IR is the special interest group by ACM, the Association for Computer Machinery. So they have a special interest group, and CLE is part of that group. Some of the other initiatives that are part of SIG-IR are TREC, which is the evaluation forum that started it all. They're hosted by NIST, the Statistical Institution of the US. NTCIR is hosted by the Japanese Statistical Association, FIRE by the Indian Statistical Association, and MediaEval is kind of in the same vein, but they focus on multimedia analysis. So CLE kind of fits into this broader community of information retrieval associations. And one thing that's interesting about CLE is the way that they're organized. So CLE is this kind of it's composed of loosely connected labs, and each of these labs have different focuses from different institutions. So this year, CLE had 15 different labs, and I'll quickly go through these, but you should be able to find this document linked in our notes. And many of these labs are also the same labs that are going to be running next year. Usually they're a multi-year effort. So the first is BioAsk. This is the large-scale biomedical semantic indexing, and they deal with large amounts of biomedical texts and trying to respond to the needs of biomedical scientists. So they do things like summarizing large texts or summarizing patient documents in a way that makes it easy to retrieve information. The second is CheckThat. This is kind of in the vein of trying to limit the spread of misinformation and fake news. And they do this by breaking up the misinformation pipeline into several stages that can be completed individually. The third is Docile. This is a document extraction task. I think this is really interesting because there's all these like paper documents that have a lot of information in them, and Docile mixes computer vision and language models in a way to extract usable information from these documents. So it's an interesting practical problem. eRisk is the early risk prediction from the internet, and so they try using social media to predict disease progression of certain diseases like depression. Exist is sexism identification in social networks. IDPP is disease progression for MS and ALS. These are neurodegenerative diseases, I believe. There's ImageCLE, which is one of the original labs, and they do mostly information retrieval from images. This year, they had a lot of medical-related presentations that I saw. So you can imagine like cysts or tumors in lower intestine and trying to do image segmentation or whatnot to get information out of that. Joker is the next one, which is automated wordplay analysis. So you can think language models for puns. LifeCLE is the AI for biodiversity kind of initiative. So there's more than just bird clay. There's a whole suite of things, and I'll talk a little bit more about this because this is the primary session I went to. There's long eval, which is trying to evaluate the performance of information retrieval systems from multiple different periods of time, because you learn a system with one set of data, but that data might change, and so they want to evaluate what that drift might be. PAN is for stylometry, this idea of being able to identify authors based on how they write. And finally, there is simple text, which is trying to simplify scientific texts. So you can think of trying to find a summary of a larger document or answering questions and whatnot. So there are 15 of these labs. They're all loosely connected, and they come together to form the CLE conference. The conference was split across 4 days. When I got there, I originally thought it was 3 for some reason. So I was prepared to kind of do this for 3 days, but it turns out there's 4. On the first day, this was mostly focused around introducing people to the conference. So we had a keynote, there were a couple of conference sessions, some overviews, and then I went to see the LifeCLE session. And then there were some poster sessions and a reception. And this is the day where I met probably the most people, because everyone is new and the whole conference was new to me. Day 2 was probably the day I drank the most coffee. But this was mostly lab sessions. So I went to LifeCLE, I went to long eval, and I went to docile. There were a couple of conference sessions spread out and a couple more lab overviews. But this was a pretty, just day full of content. Day 3 was when things started to get kind of rough in terms of staying awake, especially later in the day. But it's great that they have coffee every couple hours. We had another keynote session, and then lab reviews and some of the associated initiatives that I talked about before, which I thought were really interesting. And this was a night where we went to have dinner. We were at the top of a concert hall, it was a nice restaurant that had some punny name based on musical motif or some kind. But there's a really great view of the bay. And this was also the night that I got to see some of the Thessaloniki nightlife, which is actually quite nice. And this is the last day. The last day was more lab sessions. So here I went to check that, ImageCLE and IDPP. And then there were the closing conference sessions and the introductions the next day. So in 4 days, they packed in quite a bit. They have 15 of these sessions going on, many of them going on concurrently. They have the conference sessions. They have all these other things that need to get packed into a relatively short amount of time. So with that out of the way, I want to talk more about some of the sessions that I went to and I saw. Out of these 4 days, I took 48 pages of notes in a college ruled notebook. And I was actively engaging with the process of trying to figure out what this conference is about. So the keynote sessions were pretty interesting. The first session was by Barbara Plank, who is a researcher / professor at the University of Munich, and she focuses on human-centric natural language processing. So she brings up a couple of different challenges in human-centric natural language processing. The first is that there are lots of different languages. I think NLP right now focuses on a very few set of languages where there's lots of documents, but there are languages where there isn't that much source material. And so it becomes difficult to it becomes challenging to build NLP for those languages. Additionally, there's a lot of differences and nuances in terms of how people interpret language. And so there's this problem of human label variation, how different people interpret different statements. She also talks about this idea of active learning, and she goes through one of the papers where they do an experiment on the dynamics of training a language model and how having a human in the loop can change how labels are distributed across, how they're distributed as people give their feedback to the system. She also talks about trustworthy models. So there's these things about trying to use a disagreement between labelers on calibration and for learning different tasks. And she finally concludes with this idea of trying to improve the existing data sets that we have, because there's only so much that we can get with this like unsupervised learning process. And it's useful to have these very clean data sets to do NLP tasks on. So it goes back to that human in the loop and trying to improve data sets. Overall, I think this speak kind of set a really nice tone for the rest of the conference. Clay is very much heavily focused on language models. And as I went through the sessions, these ideas kind of stuck with me. The second keynote was on the third day by Claudia Hauff. She is a researcher at Spotify. And so this is a really interesting kind of industry looking perspective on information retrieval. She talked about how Spotify designs their systems for information retrieval, in particular around podcast search. So they have large embedding models. They use a traditional IR system to get a list of candidate results. They do re-ranking, and then they do personalization on device. And she talks about 6 different challenges with references to some of the papers that she and her colleagues have written. Talks about instance search, which is this idea of as you're typing, what are the things that come down on your Spotify results page? There's content mining on how to find new things, query understanding, online metrics, offline metrics, and UX challenges. I think the one paper that stood out here was this idea of expanding this knowledge graph. So knowledge graph expansion basically took the relationships between content in the system. They build out a graph model of those relationships, and they embedded each of the documents in a node to vec model. So you can represent the graph structure as an embedding that you can use to re-rank things. And I thought it was interesting that they built this, because that's one of the techniques that I learned in a network analysis class a couple years ago. So it's kind of cool to see these techniques used in practice in the industry. And yeah, this was an interesting keynote session. Then I'll talk a little bit about the lab sessions. So the lab session I'll talk about is LifeClay, but there's lots of different sessions. And this is the first time that I had gotten exposed to the broader LifeClay initiative. I'd done 2 or 3 years of submitting working notes to the LifeClay lab through BirdClay. And so there have been 2 iterations of the BirdClay team here at GT that I've submitted, but this is the first time that I've really seen this at a higher level. And the goal of LifeClay is to try to address the biodiversity loss risk through the building of information retrieval systems. So they have plant clay. The task here is to identify plant species. They have tens of thousands of plants, and they have millions of photos. And so it becomes a challenging problem of scale. They have GeoLifeClay, which is given a bunch of satellite imagery and rasterization data like elevation and temperature over a geospatial area, plus some time series data, try to predict what the distribution of species across a particular area. They have BirdClay, which is automated bird call classification, FungiClay, which is identifying mushrooms, and SnakeClay, which is identifying snakes. These last 2 are interesting because it's useful to be able to identify poisonous species of these things, which makes it easier for medical professionals to know whether they should be stocking up on antivenoms or whatnot. There's a limited amount of antivenoms or ways of treating these. And so it's important to be able to make useful decisions. So these are the LifeCLE tasks. The way that the lab sessions were generally organized is that they had the lab overview, which talks about all the lab tasks, the number of people who participated in those lab tasks, kind of some history, and some of the solutions. They also generally had an invited speaker, and they had the people who did working notes present. So for LifeCLE, the invited speaker was Dan Stoll. He does his research on audio species recognition in the Netherlands somewhere. I'm not sure which university, but somewhere in the Netherlands. And so he talked about automated acoustic species recognition. And he was part of the whole Shazam for birds when that became popular in 2014. You should try it out, by the way. There's an app that you can download on your phone that will detect different bird species for you, and it works surprisingly well. So this idea of Shazam for birds, but he's interested in more than just birds. He's interested in things like insects or amphibians, other places where biodiversity is at risk and where having acoustic recognition can be helpful for a way of tracking species. He discussed a couple of different ways to improve on the current state of the art. The first is to learn better input representations. So this is like learning a better Mel spectrogram. How do you break up the frequency ranges and what weights do you put on the particular frequency ranges in order to do some downstream task really well? And that first paper, LEAF, is all about learning a better input representation for the data. The second is on one or few shot learning. So this is where you want to track individuals in a data set. And this can be challenging because there's not a lot of data when you're talking about individuals. So you might want to do this if you're trying to track, maybe a small group of primates in a large area. Being able to identify individuals can help with better tracking. The last thing he talks about is building a better embedding representation. So there's this idea of building hierarchical representations where you can have a more generalizable way of representing data. And he kind of ends on this idea of having one embedding for everything, which is something that was brought up quite a bit in the LifeCLE sessions, actually. Foundational models have been a pretty big thing in the last couple of years, and I wasn't up to date with all of the recent advancements in those. And so things like Meta's, I forget the name of the model, but there's these large foundational models that are trained on very large data sets. They learn generalizable features, and they're built on this idea of self-supervision through these large transformer models. So the idea of getting one embedding for everything is coming closer to reality. All right. Then let's talk about some of the lab sessions. So I chose a couple of lab sessions that I thought were interesting. I actually met most of the authors of these labs, these working notes and presentations, but that's not the only reason why I chose them. I think they're all relatively interesting. So the first is the bird species recognition. So this is the person who won second place, I think, in the competition, and the other team that won the best working notes. So they tried out this idea of adding attention on frequency bands in their models. So you get a spectrogram, you put an attention on the frequencies, and the idea is that maybe the attention learns better weights for which frequencies are important. He found out in the end, I believe, that this model or this extension to the model didn't actually improve all that much, but his working notes are very thorough, and he got near the top of state of the art for the competition. The second I thought was really interesting. This is a multimodal approach to docile with GraphDoc, but I think this encapsulates a lot of the models that you would see here at CLE, where there are multimodal models where you're dealing with embeddings from these higher stream models, and you're trying to fuse them together to do a specific task. So here you can see that they use a couple of different models. They have a sentence embedding model that takes text and it turns them into vectors. They have a layout embedding model, which takes positions in a document and embeds them into a vector. And then they have this vision model, a SWIN transformer, to get the vision features that represents a document. And they use a very particular method of taking these two, the text embeddings and the visual embeddings, and putting them into one model that can be used for the task for docile. Really cool. This is a very complex model, very thorough, but it was really interesting to see how they put it together and how they solved the challenge. The third one is from IDPP. This was a challenge that was interesting to me because it relates to disease progression, and a lot of disease progression problems are solved via survival analysis, which is very different from the language modeling classification problems that I saw at a lot of different presentations. The key idea here is that when a person goes into a doctor's visit and data is collected, these visits happen at irregular intervals. And so this person was able to feature engineer a good way of aggregating these dynamic features in a way that helped improve their model performance by a significant margin. And so it's always good to think about ways of transforming your data to make it easier to solve the problem. And I thought this was a really good demonstration of doing feature engineering in order to solve the problem at hand. The last thing I want to talk about is check that. So check that. This was about subjectivity detection. So determining whether something is true or false, or fact or opinion. And the one thing here that I thought was interesting is that this lab was challenging because it had text from several different languages. And so in order to get the best performance on each of those languages, they had to start off with a language model that was fine-tuned to a particular language, which means a whole different set of documents that were used to train that model. And this team used back translation. So basically, like if you went to Google Docs and you translate something to one language and translate it back, that's what they did here. They went through a network of translations to increase the number of tokens that were available for training. And they found that this helped. And they used this technique last year and also this year on 4 other of the different tasks. So they competed in a total of 4 or 5 different lab tasks and had 4 or 5 different papers. So this is pretty interesting, and I think this is most indicative of most of the labs in CLE, using pre-trained models, finding ways to kind of increase the amount of training data that you have. So yeah, that is the select labs. And then I'll quickly talk about the conference sessions. So two more of these presentations. First, the conference presentations are split up into three presentations. They're usually the best of labs. So last year, the winners of those labs, whoever wrote the best papers, kind of got invited to speak at the conference. Then they had lab overviews, which just overview of what the lab was and who submitted and what the solutions were, as well as things that related to CLE. So either new data sets for evaluation or new proposed labs. And so here I'll talk about a best of labs and a new proposed lab. So the best of labs was for check that. I bring it up here because I think the way that they approach the problem is very indicative of ways that people are successful in solving these problems. So you use a pre-existing model and you fine-tune it. You take some sort of technique in order to try to improve it. So here they use manifold mix-up, which is a way of regularizing the model so that it doesn't overfit the data. And they do some data augmentation to increase the training data set. So what they do here isn't not all these pieces individually aren't new, but putting them together and solving this particular task is worthy of peer review in the conference. So this is pretty interesting. It's just very clean. They solved all the tasks. They put together a full working system, and they had lots of metrics around their experimentation. The second thing I want to talk about is a new lab. So here is CLEF, which QCLE, which stands for Quantum CLE. So this lab in the University of Padua in Italy, they have access to a quantum computer. So they proposed a new lab for doing information retrieval on quantum computers. They basically wrote an API around the quantum computer to time slice a bunch of work to teams, and they proposed a couple of different tasks. The one that I thought was interesting is feature selection, but they also have a clustering task, I believe. And so it's really cool that there's a subset of tasks that can be run on a quantum computer, and that they're going to give access to quantum computing for people to try out new techniques. So this is one that I'm actually really interested in because quantum computing is really cool. So with that, there was a lot that happened in those 4 days. You know, the content that I presented to you is probably really dense, but that's what the experience was like going to the conference. It was my first time being at an academic conference, and it was really cool to meet lots of different people, to get introduced to lots of different ideas, to see how things are organized and how ideas propagate. So some things that I took away from this is that the way that this is structured makes it really easy to drink a lot of coffee. You need to be on a lot if you want to learn everything. I'm sure if you go several times and you know what you want to see, the experience can be a lot easier, but this is kind of rough. The second is that I asked lots of questions. There were plenty of opportunities for questions, and I noticed that people were really hesitant to ask questions, but I think it's really good when somebody's preparing something to, you know, be engaged and to ask something. I think there's always something to kind of be asked, and I really enjoyed the process of trying to, you know, like maybe something I didn't understand was unclear to me. So that was kind of neat, like just, you know, asking for the mic and asking questions. I also met like a lot of people, which was really interesting. You know, people from all around the world, and then people from all sorts of different walks. So professionals, undergrads, masters, PhD students, professors. One of my favorite experiences was just like sitting down for 3 hours in the lobby with the chair of the Life Clay lab, and we talked a little about his research and his experience as a professor. He showed me his paper about turtles and Lynx, the cat. It's really cool. And the last thing I think is that submitting this conference is really, really doable. Like I think it's doable for me, but I also think it's doable for most people in the master's program who've taken something like machine learning. I think it's doable for undergrads. I saw a couple of undergrad presentations. You know, if you have some sense of how to build a full complete system, like you totally go and like feel not out of place there. So with that, I'd like to talk about strategizing, but maybe I'll stop here for questions. It's like 5:40 and this might take another 10 minutes. So I just wanted to stop here, maybe see if there are questions, and then if you have to go, then you can feel free to drop. Otherwise, I'll kind of talk a bit about the rest of the semester.
Were a lot of people able to
You can go first.
sorry. Were a lot of people able to participate in like several different clays? Like, did you see like a lot of people kind of participating in like 3 or 4 different clays? I mean, that might be too much, but
I didn't actually see too many people cross participating. I did see some people who participated in one lab, but multiple of the tasks that were in that lab. So for example, check that was a popular choice for doing multiple things. There were some people who were in larger labs, and there are a bunch of students in that lab that were participating, and they participate in different things. But I think a lot of the people that I actually talked to, they were just doing like one thing. They had like they had one working note, they had one competition they were focused on. But yeah, there was one person who like he had like 5 papers, and I was like, that's crazy. I didn't know you could do that.
yeah, that's crazy.
Okay, so I guess my question was like, how long are these papers? And then did they all came close to the SOTA models?
So most of the papers are probably like 5 to 8 pages long. I think I saw some that were longer, but they're like traditional conference paper length. Presentation 15 to 20 minutes. And some of them came state of the art, some of them didn't. I think as long as you have a complete system, they were pretty okay with the idea of having it in the conference as a working note. Some of the conference papers for sure like were more thorough, but you know, the working notes that we sent for bird clay, nowhere close to state of the art.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right, I'll move on to strategizing. Sorry for taking up a little more time than I expected. I think this should take 10 minutes. We'll have some time for questions, and then we'll call it for today. So I want to talk a little bit about strategizing for next year. So first, let's talk about the rest of the semester. I've taken this from the proposal document, but there's not all that many more sessions that we have to meet up. The next 3 sessions are going to be focused on clay. So folks will either read an overview paper and present about it, or ideally write a solution sketch to something that they find interesting and present it to try to recruit people from within this group. So we'll have that for three sessions. We'll have an open session the week before Thanksgiving, and hopefully we'll have like potential leads for different problems. And our last session is going to be on the 27th, where we'll kind of conclude everything, see the winners from the interclub competition, and try to figure out what next semester is going to look like. But really, we don't have all that many more sessions. So one of the first things for next year is doing the team formation very loosely at a high level. What this means is figuring out people who are willing to commit to writing a solution for a lab next semester. I think it's going to take between 50 to 100 plus hours to come to a solution, probably even more work to just, write down the working notes. But if you're gonna participate next semester, you should commit this as a thing that you do. Just make sure you know what the time commitment is. And then everyone should really read a lab, find one that interests them, read last year's papers, look at the data, and write up a solution sketch. Just like looking at the competition, previous year's competitions, like what are the techniques that you need? What are the models? What are the techniques? Like, how do you solve this problem in a way that's just written in like pseudocode, basically? Like how can you like sketch up a way of solving the problem? And then we actually need to do the team formation. Not entirely sure how this is going to work. In previous years, I have written up a assessment notebook for people who had no prior knowledge. And this was a way for me to filter out people by skill level, as well as their willingness to like do a little bit of work, to do something that they want to do. So it was a good filter. I'm not sure if we'll do that this semester if you're participating actively in this group. I think if you do a club competition or you do a sketch and you kind of have an idea of like what's going on, it might be okay just to place you with somebody who's willing to work with you. But yeah, team formation is one of the things that we need to figure out. So important part of that is sketching out solutions to different problems. I've started a document for the project proposals or the sketches, but basically it's just the competition, the subtask, and like a very like hand wavy, this is how we're going to solve the problem, as well as links to different papers. I think this is something, if you're interested in participating a semester, you should do this. You should open up a Google Doc, you should read the thing that you're interested in competing in, and you should write down a solution on paper. It doesn't have to be good, it just has to be something. And you have to know what the lay of the land looks like. It doesn't have to be like a physical sketch, but actually a lot of the solutions are amenable to like writing out a system diagram of some kind. So I recommend just taking a piece of paper and seeing how you might pipeline these things. But yeah, general approach, what are the techniques you want to use? What does the data set look like? And I think these solution sketches are good because you can share them with other people. And as we try to place people together, having a sketch or a solution that you kind of vaguely know what you're talking about is helpful to have. So do this. And next semester, we'll have a little bit of infrastructure set up, kind of best practices from the last couple of years of running bird clay, as well as I have quite a bit of experience from industry, just working with data pipelines and working with infrastructure. I'm sure there's other folks in this group who are working professionals or have some like software engineering experience. But I find that having everything in GitHub helps, knowing how to use Git. I found that virtual machines helps a lot, being able to deploy things to the cloud. It lets people, you have people SSH into the machines, and then the machines are just, they're set up with all the software, so people don't really have to think really hard about how to install things. And there's like a tool chain that I like a lot. It's using Python, as the general scripting language, Luigi for building up these data pipelines, Spark for doing large data processing, mostly with semi-structured data, so like CSV files or Parquet files. Spark is really good at being able to build up these complex data processing pipelines. And PyTorch. I really don't like TensorFlow. It's just like a pain to deal with. And I think a lot of industry is very heavily focused on PyTorch. So a lot of the models that I want to build this next year are going to be like PyTorch focused, at least using embedding models or building embedding models or anything, just PyTorch. So there'll be a little bit of support in terms of infrastructure. I might be footing the bill on VMs. I'm happy to, if it gets us along building, having lots of participation from our club, from our university, and showing up as a fairly large group next year at CLE 2024. So those are the three things. We'll form teams. You should find a lab and write a solution to one of those problems. And I'm just thinking about infrastructure a little bit. It's all in there. Yeah, that's the end of my presentation. And I'll take any questions if you have them for this. Where do we go next?
I don't have any questions, but I just wanted to say thank you for hand holding us through this. I appreciate it.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot, like knowing how to, like when things are happening, what things are happening. It's really difficult if you don't even know they exist. So yeah, I definitely hope that I can help spread some of that knowledge so that everyone can kind of start on this with a even footing.
Thanks, Anthony. I think it was really good information here. Thank you very much for sharing.
Cool. Well, if there aren't any questions, I'll stop the recording. I just hate trying to find the stop recording.